When you're little, second star to the right feels like directions. When you're 34, it feels more like nostalgia. So, I wanted to find out, are we ever really too old to have this kind of fun? By the end of the video, you'll see exactly how I made a Disney park style Peter Pan costume, and how a few texts to my friends turned this into a full Peter Pan group at Oogie Boogie Bash. Group costumes are where I have the most fun, and when Oogie Boogie Bash tickets dropped, a Peter Pan group just clicked. Hook, Smee, the Lost Boys, it was just too good to pass up. And for my version, I wanted it to be comfortable, washable, and as close to the park's costume as possible, without losing the spark that makes costume building fun, even as an adult. Quick note before we dive into the build. Some versions of Peter Pan include really harmful depictions of native people and some really outdated gender stuff. In this video, I'm sticking to the neutral Disney park style costume and doing my best not to repeat those stereotypes. If you want to dig into that history and hear from Indigenous creators and scholars, I've linked several great resources in the description. Now, on to the build. Starting out with shorts. The Disney Parks Peter Pan costume has some really short shorts. If you've ever sewn shorts or pants before, you know that it sucks. So whenever possible, I buy my shorts and pants for my costumes. This time, I bought some green shorts from Nautica that were close enough. Unfortunately, they were too long. So based on the reference, I marked out the desired length. I took it to the table and made markings for seam allowance and cut off the extra. I pressed the seam first. I removed the platform of my sewing machine, pinned the hem, and sewed the legs. For a professional finish, I pressed the hem of the legs one more time. This is as much of my legs as you're going to see, so enjoy it while it lasts. Next is the leggings. If I was you, I would just buy leggings. Unfortunately, they don't sell them in my size, so I was stuck sewing them myself. I bought a pattern from Fairtrade called Lightspeed Leggings. I picked it because there's only one seam down the inner leg. I adjusted the pattern digitally, then fired up my projector for projecting them. I have a YouTube video going over projector patterns, so feel free to check it out above. I laid out my fabric and cut out the pieces with a rotary cutter. I then pinned the pieces and sewed them together with a serger. With the leggings assembled, I could try them on. The fit was okay, but could use some adjustment. So I pinned down one leg to mark where I needed it tighter. I took the leggings off and used a heat erasable pen to mark the new sewing line. Then I serged along the line. With that leg fitting well, I copied it over to the other leg and serged it. To finish it off, we needed to finish the leg hem and waistband. I marked, cut off the extra fabric, and sewed the hem of the leg with my cover stitch machine. For the waistband, I used 3/4 inch woven elastic, cut and sewed to the right size. Making sure to equally space it out, I pinned the waistband along the top of the leggings. I I then zigzag stitched the waistband on and cut off the extra fabric from the top. I then double rolled the waistband and stitched. Lastly, I added one of my custom labels to the leggings and they were done. The belt. The belt is a pretty standard Vegetan belt. I started by rolling out a thick piece of leather and measuring my waist. I cut a straight edge with a gigantic ruler, then used a strap cutter to cut a piece longer than needed. It may have taken me 2 tries. I then beveled the edges. I cut the belt to length, but I made sure to leave extra to attach the buckle. I cut a slot for the buckle and made holes for the rivets. I reduced the thickness of the leather near the buckle. And used my hole punch to make belt holes. Then it was time for dyeing. I ran some tests with dye left over from previous projects until I found one I liked. I chose a water stain, so I wet the entire belt first to get an even result. I came back the next day to seal it. After waiting another day for that to dry, I burnished the edges. Then I hammered on the rivets to attach the buckle. With that, I tested the belt. And then realized I forgot to make belt keepers. I was running out of time, so I needed to get them done that night. My first try dyed them too dark. I ended up not dyeing them and just sealing them to get a close enough color. I sped up the drying process for the sealer with a hairdryer. I finished the edges, sewed the ends together, and I was done. The wig. While I've spent dozens of hours cutting hair for my Chewbacca costume, that does not make me good at cutting wigs. I started out by pinning the wig on my wig form that is padded out to my measurements. I followed a pixie cut tutorial, which I'll link down in the description. I started by pinning the hair of the top of the head out of the way. I sprayed the hair down with water and cut vertical sections, getting the hair roughly to length. Letting the top down, I cut vertical sections, getting it to final length. Loves me, just look at me. I'm like a monkey in a coconut tree. That got me close. For final adjustments, I put the wig on, looked in the mirror, marked the clips where I needed to cut, and cut it at the table. I repeated that many, many times until I got the wig to look how I wanted it to be. The tunic. I started by drafting the tunic from a button-up shirt pattern I've already adjusted to fit me. I combined the yoke and lower back pieces into one full back piece. On the front, I removed the button placket so it would be a pullover tunic instead of a shirt. I measured where I wanted the tunic hem to hit in the mirror and wrote that down. Then I straightened the bottom hem of the front and back and added the extra length for the petals. I did the same thing for the sleeves, measured the length I wanted and added the length for the petals. I bumped the collar height up a bit so it would match the reference better. With that, I had my first version of the pattern and it was time to project it. I turned on my projector and did a quick sanity check against a shirt I've already made with the original pattern. Once I knew the scale was right, I cut the mock-up from muslin, front, back, one sleeve, and the collar. I only cut one sleeve because that's all I needed to test with. I sewed the front and back together at the shoulder seams, then pinned and sewed on the sleeve. So I made a mistake. I thought there was something wrong with the length of the back of the shirt, especially between the top of the shoulder and the bottom of where the sleeve attaches. It just looked too long. It looked like 2 inches too long. And so I took off an inch just to be safe because I was trusting my gut. And what I found by trying to pin the sleeve in is that I needed that inch. That inch was there for a reason. And so now I'm going to have to rip this apart, unpin the sleeve, and cut out a new back. So, seam ripper time. I fixed the back pattern, recut the back, and sewed the new back to the old front at the shoulders. I pinned the sleeve back on, checked the fit, and good news. The sleeve now fits on the shirt perfectly. I sewed on the sleeve again, closed up the side seams, and tried the mock-up on. Welcome to seeing me in my bag form. The fit overall was okay, but the shoulders were too wide. I marked where the shoulder seam actually needed to be, then I seam ripped the sleeve back off so I could adjust the pattern properly. I turned the projector back on, updated the shoulder seam length on the computer, and projected the new lines. I marked the changes on both the front and back pieces, then seam ripped the shoulder seams so I could cut them symmetrically. I trimmed along the new lines, re-sewed the shoulders, reattached the sleeve, and added the collar. To evaluate the fit, I put the tunic on my duct tape mannequin. These mannequins are amazing for rough fit and marking adjustments without constantly having to change clothes. Comparing to my reference photos, I tweaked the collar shape and trimmed off some extra fabric. I was happy with the body fit and collar, so I moved on to the sleeve. I marked the sleeve length I wanted on the mock-up while it was on the mannequin. Off camera, I cut petal hems into the bottom of the tunic and sleeve and narrowed the sleeves a bit. I tried the mock-up on with the belt to see the whole look together. It was very close, but I decided I still wanted the tunic and the sleeves just a bit longer. At that point, it was time to commit those changes back into my digital pattern. I seam ripped the entire mock-up apart and wrote my adjustment notes on the fabric pieces. I cut the front and back in half lengthwise so they'd lie flat and be easier to digitize. I photographed all the pieces on my cutting mat, brought the photos into Photoshop to unskew them, then I imported them into Inkscape and used them as a guide to make the final adjustments to the pattern. With the pattern locked in, it was time to cut. I turned the projector back on and laid out my fabric. a lime green stretch ponte knit to match the part costume. I chose a knit so the tunic would stretch, be comfortable, and be easier to move in. Because it stretches, I knew I'd have to use a stretch-friendly stitch and be careful not to pop seams. I cut all of the pattern pieces twice, once for the outer layer and once for the lining. And I cut the sleeves 4 times because each sleeve needs both an outer and an inner layer. Lining the tunic in the same fabric is what gets me that nice, clean front slit like the Disneyland version. For sewing, I started with the basics. Shoulder seams first on both the outer tunic and lining. I sewed everything with a zigzag stitch so the seams could stretch with the knit. Then I pinned and sewed on all the sleeves. Once the sleeves were on, I marked how long I wanted the front slit to be and drew in my seam allowance. I connected those marks into a triangle guideline from one seam allowance down to the bottom of the slit and back up to the other side. Then I sewed the side seams from the sleeve underarm all the way around to the hem on both layers. Starting at the center back, I pinned the collar onto the neckline all the way around to the front. This is to make sure that the collar ends up in the right location. This is one of those slow, careful steps. Lots of pins, and lots of chances to accidentally sew in a fold, so I took my time. Once the collar was on, I had a finished outer layer and a finished lining ready to connect together. With the right sides together, I tucked the lining inside the outer tunic. I pinned along the center front, where the slit should be, matching all my triangle markings. Then I pinned and sewed around the collar, joining the 2 layers at the neckline. After that, I stitched along the triangle shape to sew the front slit, pivoting at the point. I carefully cut the slit open along the center line, stopping just before the stitching at the triangle tip. Then I flipped everything right side out and got my first real look of the tunic. It looked a little puffy at this stage, but that's just because nothing had been pressed yet. I still couldn't resist putting it on the mannequin to see how it was coming together. Next up was pressing, which really takes something from looking like a homemade object to something actually professional. This was the last chance to really get to the inside seams, so I took my time pressing everything flat. Once everything was crisp, I pinned the bottom hem, starting by matching the tip of each petal. I did the same thing pinning on one of the sleeves. I sewed the bottom hem and that one sleeve hem with a zigzag stitch. Then I trimmed the points so the petal tips wouldn't be bulky once turned right side out. I intentionally only hemmed the one sleeve, leaving the other one open so I could still turn the tunic right side out later. On the unhemmed sleeve, I marked the seam allowances on both the outer and lining layers and gave it another good press. Now I could move on to the hardware, the eyelets down the front slit. Before committing, I tested eyelets on a piece of scrap knit fabric because stretch fabrics and rigid hardware don't always work together. For the first test, I used interfacing on just one layer and hammered in the eyelet. When I stretched the fabric, the eyelet immediately popped out. I went back to the real Tunic and just marked where each eyelet would go while I thought through a fix. For the second test, I added fusible interfacing to both layers of the fabric where the eyelet goes. That worked great. So I cut interfacing for all the eyelet positions on the actual Tunic. I turned the Tunic inside out, fused interfacing to both sides of the slit, turned it right side out, punched the holes, and set all the eyelets. While I was pulling the Tunic onto the mannequin, the bottom slit ripped just a couple of millimeters. I hand sewed the rip closed with an invisible stitch and went over it twice so it wouldn't spread. I used an invisible stitch to hand sew the hem on the sleeve we couldn't reach previously with the machine. For lacing, I started with some leftover leather lace from a previous project. The soft side of the leather shed a lot, so I treated it with gum tragacanth and burnished it just like the belt edges. I tested it on scrap fabric and immediately saw that it stained really badly. To avoid ruining the Tunic, I switched to faux suede lacing instead. I laced up the Tunic, cut lacing to length, and the front detail was done. As a final touch, I sewed in one of my custom woven garment labels. It's a small thing, but it makes the Tunic feel like a real finished costume and shows how proud I am of the build. The hat. I wanted to use Peter Pan's hat as an excuse to learn a new technique. Wet felting. Quick explanation. Wet felting is taking wool fibers, warm soapy water, and friction, and creating a non-woven fabric. Perfect for hats. Before felting, I needed a hat pattern. I put my Peter Pan wig on my padded mannequin head and measured the width I wanted the hat to be. I used that measurement to sketch the bottom edge of the hat on paper. I freehanded the rest of the shape above it, knowing I was only drawing half the pattern. When I liked the shape, I cut 2 out. I taped both halves together and tested the paper hat on the wig head. Bottom curve wasn't the shape I wanted, so I rounded it out. It also wasn't wide enough, so I cut down the taped front seam and added width with a scrap of paper. It still wasn't quite right, so I rounded the bottom a bit more and added one more extension for width. After tweaking, the paper hat finally looked right on the wig head. I wanted to share the pattern, so I photographed it and traced it in Inkscape. That printable pattern is what I'm linking in the description if you want to make this hat too. From my research, wool shrinks a lot when you felt it. Based on the recommendations I found, I scaled my hat pattern up about 40% to compensate for shrinkage. Using my projector, I projected the enlarged pattern onto a piece of white foam used for packing and traced it. This foam piece is what we call a resist. It goes inside the wool sandwich so that the two sides of the wool hat don't fuse together. I also traced the pattern at 100% scale to later use as a reference for size. Then I cut out the foam resist and got ready to lay down wool. For wool, I used green merino roving from Etsy. Under everything, I laid down this blue bubbly plastic. It's a hot tub liner that doubles as my felting mat. I began by wetting the surface with a ball sprinkler full of warm soapy water and laying fibers around the outline of the resist, overlapping the edges slightly. That first layer went perpendicular around the edges, then horizontal to fill in the middle. I covered the wool with scrap netting left over from my Chewbacca suit to hold everything in place. Then I wet it all with warm soapy water. On top of that, I added another layer of wool fibers, this time horizontal, and wet it down again. Then I placed the foam resist on top and folded the wool edges up over it. On the other side, I repeated a vertical layer of fibers, wet it, then a horizontal layer. I flipped the whole thing over and folded over any loose edges so the resist was fully sandwiched. Now it was time to actually felt and shrink it. I folded the hot tub liner over so the bubble side faced the wool, then rolled everything around a pool noodle. I did sets of 10 rolls, then rotated the hat 90 degrees and repeated. I rolled the hat in all 4 directions, flipped it over, and rolled in all 4 directions again. Rotating and flipping like this helps the wool shrink evenly. Once it was more stable, I started rolling without the pool noodle, just the wool and the bubble mat. Again, 10 rolls in all 4 directions, flip, 10 rolls in all 4 directions. At this stage, the wool shrunk enough that the foam resist started to curl inside. That's my cue that it's time to remove the resist. I cut a small snip at the bottom of the brim and then cut around the entire brim edge. Then I pulled out the foam resist so I was left with a hollow felt hat shell. Time to shrink it down to the final size and clean up the shape. I wrung out the water and then soaked the hat in fresh hot water for about a minute. After wringing it again, I put my hand inside and rubbed the felt along the cut edge to smooth out the fold line. I did that along both sides of the brim. Because the resist prevented the 2 sides from felting together, I could now open the hat and work both layers. I rolled the hat by hand on the bubble mat. 10 rolls in each direction, flip 10 more in each direction. At this point, I could start turning the hat inside out and repeat the rolling from both sides. I kept checking the size against the 100% scale paper pattern until it was close. To fine-tune the shape, I rolled only specific areas to shrink them more and sculpt the silhouette. Once I was happy with the general shape, I cut the brim to its final shape using the traced reference pattern. Then I tried the hat on the wig head, and on my actual head with the wig. The shape looked great, but it fit too loose. I tried a few experiments to see if I could shrink it more. I pinned it to my wig stand and hit it with my steamer. No real shrinkage. I tried ironing it. Still no change. I even dipped the brim in boiling water and nothing. It stubbornly stayed the same size. At that point, I accepted it. The hat wasn't going to shrink anymore, so I decided to take it in the old-fashioned way, with hand sewing. I used matching thread and a backstitch on the inside of the hat to take out the extra width. Once it fit, I trimmed off the extra felt on the inside seam. To hide the seam, I tried a felting needle, repeatedly stabbing along the join. Maybe this was just me trying to get out some anger. It didn't really work very well, so I also rubbed it with my fingernail to blend the fibers. I never got it completely invisible, but it's in the back of the hat, so I decided I could live with it. Next up, the feather. I had leftover white feathers and some red RIT dye from previous projects, so I decided to custom dye my own. I filled a dye pot with water, added a splash of vinegar, added RIT dye, and dropped the feathers in. After about a minute, I poured out the dye and rinsed the feathers until the water ran clear. I dried the feathers with a hairdryer in my bathroom. While drying, you have to smooth the barbs of the feathers back into place so they don't look ragged. I picked my favorite feather and used an awl to poke a hole in the hat for it. I also used an awl to poke a couple of tiny holes through the quill so I could sew it down from the inside. I stitched the feather in place and then noticed something. When I brought the hat over to the rest of the costume, the color felt wrong. The green was too light compared to the rest of the costume, and it really bugged me. This is a moment where a sensible person might say, "Brent, it's fine, don't risk dyeing it." And they'd be at least partially right. I cut off the threads so I could remove the feather so I wouldn't ruin it. Then I mixed up a new dye bath with dark green RIT dye and a bit of navy. Because I've dyed over existing colored fabrics before, I knew over dyeing often doesn't shift the color as much as you think. So I went aggressive. A lot of dye and very short time in the pot. What could go wrong? I pre-wetted the hat to help the dye cover evenly, then dropped it in. I left it in for less than a minute and then rinsed it in the sink. The color always looks darker when it's wet, so at first I wasn't too worried. But as I wrung it out, disaster. It was way too dark. And it was the Sunday afternoon right before Oogie Boogie Bash week. I was devastated. I didn't have weeknights free to redo it, which meant I had to remake the entire hat from scratch that day. I guess the silver lining was now I knew exactly how much the wool shrinks and what fit I wanted. I updated the pattern so the resist only needed to be about 25% larger than the final hat. The pattern I'm sharing with you in the description is the updated version. Time to remake the hat, but smarter. I traced the updated pattern onto the old foam resist and onto my reference paper, and then cut out the new resist. This time I also traced the resist shape directly onto my cutting mat with chalk, so I had a clear guide. From here I repeated the basic felting workflow but faster. I laid down an outer ring of wool fibers and 2 full layers over the chalk outline. Added the foam resist, then 2 more layers of wool on top. Rolled it up in the pool noodle and did my sets of rolls in all directions. Switched to rolling without the pool noodle, then cut open the brim and removed the resist. I soaked the hat in hot water again and rolled and shaped it down to the final size. Once I was happy, I trimmed the brim to the final shape. Now for dyeing. Again. But careful this time. You're probably thinking, "Brent, don't do it." And honestly, fair. This time, I did it smartly. I used just a small amount of dark green dye and did super short dips. I dunk the hat, immediately pull it out and rinse it and check the color. Nope. Still needs to be darker.
I repeated that somewhere between 6 and 12 times, slowly building the color up. Eventually, I hit the exact green I wanted without overshooting it. Crisis averted. All that was left was adding the feather back on. I poked the hole for the feather in the hat, sewed it on from the inside like before, and with that, the Peter Pan hat was finally done and actually the right color and fit. To finish off the costume, I bought a used pair of suede shoes secondhand, some green socks, and a forest green turtleneck to wear under the tunic. When we were kids, magic was easy to find. Somewhere along the way, life got louder, grown-up things crowded it out. But tonight reminded me it's still waiting for us, if we remember to look up. We're never too old to make, to laugh, to play. It isn't a miracle, just small moments of joy shared with friends who still believe. And if you keep a little wonder in your heart, you'll always know the way to the second star.
If this gave you a nudge to make something or text a friend, let me know in the comments. Links for patterns, fabrics, and my projector tutorial are below. Next up, the final reveal for my Chewbacca costume. Thanks for flying with us.